Everyone feared the billionaire, until the new single Datica quad refused to bow. On his first morning at Kingsley Tower, Caleb Danner was warned. Never look Victoria Kingsley directly in the eyes, never ask questions, and never say no to the executive floor. When she entered the lobby, every employee shrank back and dropped their gaze. Caleb stood straight, scanning the room the way a trained security professional does. Victoria noticed. Then an older visitor appeared at the desk requesting a meeting, and she ordered Caleb to remove him by force. Caleb looked at her without flinching and said, "I was hired to protect you, not to turn a wrong order into a right action." The hall went so quiet you could hear the ventilation hum. Before the guards took the old man away, he leaned toward Caleb and whispered that someone inside the company had been quietly steering Victoria toward her own destruction. If the only person worth trusting is the one willing to say no, stay close, because what Caleb is about to uncover will change everything inside those walls. The man's name was Elias Ward, and he was 64 years old, soft-spoken, carrying a leather satchel worn at the corners, and presenting a visitor's access card that had been perfectly valid until 9 minutes before he arrived, a detail Caleb noticed the moment he cross-checked the timestamp against the building's entry log. Elias had an appointment scheduled through Victoria's own office, a calendar entry confirmed in the executive assistant system. Yet Dean Kessler, head of building security, a thick-armed man of 47, who moved through every room like he owned the floor plans, had declared him a banned visitor without producing a single written directive to back that claim. Caleb had been a federal witness protection officer long enough to know that paperwork gaps were never accidental, that the absence of documentation was itself a kind of signature, and what he saw in Kessler's face when the old man was named was not the calm of someone enforcing policy, but the tightening of someone managing a problem. Elias pressed his case gently, explaining the appointment, holding his badge out with steady hands. And it was at that moment Victoria swept through the lobby with Preston Vale, trailing at her shoulder like a shadow in a tailored suit. Preston, 54, silver-haired, the kind of man who had learned long ago to wear patience the way other men wore cologne. He leaned close to Victoria and said something low and precise, and Caleb watched the temperature in her expression drop several degrees before she turned and told him to remove the old man from the premises. The lobby held its breath. Caleb said, with no particular emotion, that he would not use force against a person who had made no threatening gesture, committed no violation, and held a legitimate appointment with the executive office. Victoria's eyes settled on him the way a searchlight settles on a figure in open water. Not angry yet, not entirely, but calculating the nature of what she had just encountered. Elias used the few seconds of confusion to press something small and cold into Caleb's palm, a metal card, matte finished, etched with 2 characters, K-17. Then Kessler's men came, and Elias was taken below, and just before the stairwell door closed, the old man turned back and said, in a voice quiet enough that only the nearest 3 people heard it, "The one who made you fear everyone else is the one you should fear most." The words landed in the lobby and dissolved into the marble, but Caleb kept them, turning them over the way a locksmith turns a key he has not yet found the door for. Victoria summoned him to the executive floor within the hour, and Preston was already there when the elevator opened, seated in the kind of chair that communicates authority without appearing to try, suggesting with the smooth efficiency of a man who had practiced the move 100 times that the cleanest resolution was immediate termination, that the optics of a new guard publicly defying the CEO in front of 40 employees were simply too damaging to manage any other way. Caleb did not apologize. He laid out what he had observed in the sequence that a trained investigator lays out facts. Elias Ward's access card had been active for 3 years and revoked at 8:51 that morning, 9 minutes before the man walked through the door. The appointment existed in the system. Kessler had produced no written authorization for the ban, and the timeline suggested the revocation was designed to coincide with the visit rather than precede it. Victoria said he was overstepping, that his job was access control and presence, not analysis, and she instructed Kessler to process his termination. Caleb nodded once and turned toward the elevator, and it was in that turning that he saw it. A floor indicator on Victoria's private lift, displaying a number that did not correspond to any level in the building's public directory, and then the cab began to descend without a call command, moving on its own, and Caleb stepped back across the room in 3 strides and caught Victoria by the arm an instant before she would have stepped inside. The elevator completed its unprompted journey and returned empty, and the diagnostic that followed confirmed remote access had been used from an external terminal. Kessler said it was a software glitch. Caleb pointed to the corridor camera feeds cycling on the security monitor and noted, without raising his voice, that the same 22-second loop had played 3 times in the last 4 minutes, which meant someone had patched a static segment over the live feed. Victoria canceled the termination. She said nothing else about the incident and instructed everyone in the room to treat it as an internal technical matter. She could not afford the board discovering that Atlas Shield, the flagship its smart security product Kingsley Dominion was preparing to launch across hundreds of buildings, was showing instability before rollout. Caleb asked where Elias Ward had been taken. Kessler said the old man had been turned over to the police. Caleb filed that answer in the same place he filed the missing paperwork. As a problem with no documentation, which meant it was not a solution but a story someone wanted believed. Victoria watched him from across the room and said nothing, but she had already begun to understand that this man's value was not in his willingness to agree with her. She had not kept him because she trusted him. She had kept him because everyone she did trust had said exactly the same things in exactly the same order, and the uniformity of it, seen clearly for the first time, was starting to feel less like loyalty and more like rehearsal. In the elevator going down, Caleb opened his palm and looked at the K-17 card, and it was warm against his skin, slightly warmer than it should have been, as though somewhere inside the building a receiver had just woken up and recognized it. The metal card stayed in Caleb's jacket pocket through the rest of his shift, and by midnight he had matched its designation against an old fire safety schematic he found in the building's emergency records archive. K-17 corresponded to a decommissioned mechanical room occupying the structural gap between the 16th and 17th floors, a space that had been sealed off during a renovation 9 years earlier and had since disappeared from every current floor plan as completely as if it had never existed. He went there alone in the last hour before dawn, climbing through a maintenance corridor with a flashlight and the kind of focused calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from years of learning to work alongside it, and the metal card opened a door that had no visible lock on its face. The mechanism was embedded in the frame, magnetic, responding to a frequency in the card itself. Inside was cool and smelled of circuitry and old concrete, and arranged along one wall was a set of rack-mounted servers from an earlier era, their indicator lights still blinking in the dark with the quiet persistence of a heartbeat no one had thought to stop. Caleb found printed logs bundled in a waterproof sleeve, access card histories going back 14 months, a list of 43 cameras flagged with override notations, and a folder of termination orders bearing Victoria Kingsley's digital signature. Orders authorizing the dismissal of senior engineers, compliance officers, and one internal auditor, all of them dated during periods when building records placed Victoria in Singapore, Frankfurt, and Dubai. She had not signed those documents. Someone had used her credentials while she was thousands of miles away, building a paper trail that would make it look as though she had methodically cleared out every person capable of asking the right questions. It was that folder Caleb was still holding when the door opened behind him, and Victoria stepped into the room with her jaw set and her eyes carrying the particular fury of a person who has found someone in a place they were never supposed to be. She told him she knew what corporate espionage looked like, and she was looking at it. He turned the folder around and set it on the server rack in front of her. She read the first page, then the second, and the expression on her face moved through anger and into something colder and more complicated. Recognition, the specific ache of understanding that the people she believed were protecting her were the ones she needed protecting from. Preston appeared in the doorway minutes later, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected to find only confusion, and told Victoria that the word of a man who had worked in the building for less than 48 hours was not worth setting against the loyalty of advisors who had served her family for decades. Caleb picked up the K-17 card from the rack and placed it on the table between them without a word. Victoria looked at it for a long moment, and then she told Preston to leave. She told Caleb to stay. She said she was not doing it because she trusted him, and he said he understood that, because every person who had told her what she wanted to hear had been granted her trust, and none of them had earned it. He was appointed her direct protection effective that hour, above Kessler's authority, reporting only to her, and, as he followed her out of the hidden room, the security monitor in the main hallway lit up with footage. Elias Ward, standing in an industrial space, holding something that looked enough like a weapon to end a man's career and freedom, with text underneath it promising that he would not reach the shareholder conference alive. Caleb looked at the image for exactly 4 seconds and said, "That video was made to stop you from looking for him." The drive to the Kingsley family's private archive facility took them an hour south of the city, through neighborhoods that thinned into estate lots, and eventually into a property hidden behind a tree line so dense it absorbed sound. A stone building that had served as the family's secondary records vault since Victoria's father ran the company, before digitization became the standard, and long before Preston Vale had any reason to suggest one. Victoria's father had not trusted digital records for anything he considered truly sensitive, a habit his daughter had dismissed as paranoia, until this particular Tuesday morning, when she unlocked the vault and began reading through binders of original transaction records that had never been entered into Kingsley Dominion's internal system. On the drive, Caleb had asked, once, why he left federal work, and he answered only that he had once followed an order he should have questioned, and a colleague had paid for that choice with 3 months in a hospital and a career that never fully recovered, and he had decided then that rank and correctness were not the same thing. Victoria told him, after a silence long enough to mean she was deciding whether to speak, that Preston had been the one who told her after her father's death that the only way to hold power in this family's company was to make sure everyone in the room was at least a little afraid of her, and she had believed him, and she had been very good at it. They found what they needed in the third hour. A ledger cross-referencing payments to 11 construction subcontractors, none of which appeared in any public filings, and the total across 18 months exceeded $180 million drawn from project accounts and rerouted through a sequence of holding companies registered in 3 different countries. A separate technical document described Atlas Shield's architecture and noted, in language carefully buried in an appendix, a master access protocol that had never appeared in the version of the contract shown to clients or to the board. A skeleton key, essentially, capable of opening, locking, or overriding any door, camera, or communication relay in every building connected to the system. The alarm came without warning. Every door in the archive sealed simultaneously with a hydraulic clunk, and within minutes a team of Kessler's men were at the perimeter with a cover story about a triggered intrusion alert, which was impossible because Caleb had disabled the property's wireless transmitter on arrival. He had not disabled the vehicle tracker, which meant Kessler had followed them through Victoria's own car. He found the device under the rear wheel well in under 90 seconds, pocketed it, and led Victoria through a maintenance tunnel beneath the property that dated from the original construction, unlit, low-ceilinged, smelling of mineral water and old mortar. And they emerged 200 yards from the building into a stand of oaks where the night air was cold, and Victoria stood very still for a moment, processing the fact that she had just been forced to flee her own family's property by a man her own security department had sent. She asked Caleb why he had come back for her when he could have used the tunnel to simply leave. He said he did not have to like her to recognize that she was being hunted, and those were 2 entirely separate considerations. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, and she read the notification with the stillness of someone receiving news they already half expected. The board had been formally convened by Preston Vale to vote on a resolution questioning her fitness to lead. Victoria could not disappear. That was the brutal arithmetic of her position. Every hour she remained out of sight gave Preston's narrative more room to breathe, more space to calcify into the story the board would be deciding on. And so she chose to appear at the investor dinner already scheduled for that week, rather than cancel and hand him the proof of instability he needed. Caleb told her the building's security systems had been compromised at the hardware level, and that appearing in a controlled environment managed by Kessler was walking into a room where every exit had been pre-decided by someone else. She told him that, if she stayed home, she had already lost. The dinner occupied the 40th floor of Kingsley Tower, a room of glass and soft lighting, and 200 people who watched Victoria enter with the careful, calibrated attention of people who had learned to read the weather of powerful rooms. Preston circulated through the crowd like he owned the mood of the evening, finding her twice near the windows to ask pointed questions about the Atlas Shield timeline and the whereabouts of Elias Ward, each question wrapped in the syntax of concern, each one designed to rattle her composure in front of witnesses. Kessler approached Caleb midway through the evening and told him to surrender the K-17 card, and Victoria, hearing the exchange, added her instruction to the same effect. She needed the evening to pass without incident, and the card was a visible provocation. Caleb said, in a voice pitched to carry 3 feet in every direction, that if Kessler had nothing to hide, he had no reason to want the card that a retired engineer had risked his freedom to preserve. The fire alarm sounded at 9:47, and the security team began directing guests toward Victoria's private elevator in a flow that felt practiced and deliberate, and Caleb stepped in front of her and moved her toward the stairwell instead, because emergency protocol for this building required the use of fire stairs when any NES alarm sounded on a floor above the 20th, and directing a principal toward an enclosed elevator during an active alarm was not a mistake. It was a method. They were 3 flights down when a figure in a maintenance uniform appeared from a door on the landing and reached for the document satchel Victoria carried under her arm. Caleb put the man against the wall in 4 controlled seconds, efficiently, without a single blow that would leave a mark beyond bruising, and they continued down the stairs to street level. The camera record, by the time investigators pulled it, showed only a static spliced version of events in which Caleb appeared to assault an unarmed service worker and force a struggling Victoria Kingsley toward an emergency exit. Kessler issued the order building-wide. Caleb Danner was detaining the CEO against her will. Lock it down. Victoria stood on the sidewalk outside the tower, with rain beginning to fall and security vehicles rolling in from both ends of the block. And she had exactly one choice that would cost her nothing publicly and protect her personally. She could hand him to them. She looked at the men approaching, and then back at Caleb, and she did not move. She did not speak for the board, or for the optics, or for the story that would be written in the morning. In the time it took a raindrop to travel from her collar to the pavement, she chose the man who had told her no. And then Caleb's phone lit up with a photograph, his daughter Lena, backpack on, walking across the university quad toward the east gate, and beneath the image, in plain text, the message read, "Stand down, or your daughter pays for your stubbornness." Caleb called Lena before he said a single word to Victoria, not because he needed to explain the call, not because he owed anyone a delay, but because the only thing in his 23 years of work that had ever genuinely frightened him was the gap between the moment he heard something was wrong and the moment he knew she was safe. She picked up on the second ring, and her voice was the unremarkable, slightly annoyed voice of a 19-year-old interrupted during a study session, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in weeks. He kept his tone level and told her to go to the campus security office and stay there, to call the number he was about to give her, and not to go anywhere alone until he confirmed it was clear. Lena asked 3 questions. Was he hurt? Was it bad? And did he need her to do anything else? And none of her questions were about herself, which told him everything he needed to know about who she had become. And he said no. Stay put. And that was the end of the call. An old colleague from his federal years owed him several significant favors, and by the time Caleb ended that second call, a protection detail had been arranged for the duration. Victoria said she was sorry. She said it simply, without the throat-clearing qualifications powerful people usually insert to soften the blow to their own dignity, and she meant it in the specific way of someone who has just seen the edge of what their situation has cost someone outside it. She offered him money, a plane, a safe route out of Chicago with his daughter, and he told her that the man threatening Lena would not stop threatening her once the threat had worked. It would only confirm that the method was effective. They moved through a section of the building's sub-basement that predated the Atlas Shield installation, and therefore carried no live sensors, an irony that Elias Ward had apparently anticipated when he built his parallel system, leaving pockets of analog infrastructure throughout the structure like a man hiding keys for a future he hoped would never come. In that dim, humming space, Victoria said she had always known her employees were afraid of her, and she had told herself that fear was a reasonable proxy for discipline, that it kept the edges clean and the decisions fast. Caleb said that fear produced clean surfaces and rotten foundations, It created buildings where no one would pull the fire alarm because they were more afraid of the person who might be inconvenienced by the evacuation than they were of the fire itself. Nora Bellamy reached them through an encrypted message routed through Elias's old server, offering her help with a caution that made clear she was not fully certain of anyone yet, and what she had found in the succession documents was precise and devastating. Preston had identified a provision in the company's governance charter, allowing the board to transfer executive authority on an emergency basis if the sitting CEO could be shown to have lost operational control during a security incident affecting Kingsley infrastructure. 2 conditions. Kingsley systems breached under her watch, already staged. Victoria deemed unfit by a board vote, nearly arranged. Caleb traced the intermittent signal the K-17 card had been broadcasting to a decommissioned Atlas relay station 3 blocks from the tower, an outpost the system had never formally shut down, and behind a steel door in that cold, forgotten room they heard the oldest sound in the world for someone who has been looking, a human voice, weak but distinct, calling for help. Elias Ward had lost weight he could not afford to lose, and his right wrist was bound to a pipe with a restraint that had cut deep into the skin, and the first thing he said when Caleb broke the lock and opened the door was not a greeting but a technical correction. He said the K-17 server contained a full redundant backup of every access log since Atlas Shield's soft launch testing began, stored on hardware entirely air-gapped from the main network, meaning that every use of the master key, every remote override, every falsified timestamp was preserved in a medium that could not be wiped from a keyboard. Preston had been holding Elias here for exactly that reason. Not to hurt him, but to prevent him from sharing the backup's physical location with anyone until after the shareholder conference, at which point the plan would be complete and the evidence would become moot, buried under a legal structure that would take years to unpack. Elias explained Atlas Shield's vulnerability with the precision of the engineer who had built it. A physical server, freestanding, located in a hardened room below Kingsley Tower's foundation level, logged every master key activation in write-protected sectors that could not be altered from any remote terminal. It was the dead man's switch he had built into the system without telling Preston, a safeguard against exactly the scenario now unfolding. Preston's plan for the shareholder conference was not subtle in its ambition. At the moment the board convened to vote, Atlas Shield would activate a full lockdown of Kingsley Tower, sealing every exit, severing internal communications, routing all security feeds through Kessler's private terminal, and triggering an automated report attributing the incident to an unauthorized override logged under Victoria's credentials. Preston would then arrive as the man who could restore order, the only person with the presence of mind to manage the crisis his own hands had manufactured, and the board would ratify his authority before the room understood what it had witnessed. The foreign consortium purchasing covert access to the master key had transferred the first installment already. The rest was contingent on delivery of the working protocol following the conference. Victoria said they needed to call federal law enforcement immediately, and Elias said Kessler had placed assets inside the private security detail monitoring the building's perimeter. Anyone arriving with a warrant would encounter locked systems and an active crisis protocol before they reached the front door, and the evidence on the K-17 server would be 6 feet of concrete away from anyone trying to retrieve it. Caleb proposed a structure that required both of them to do something neither had ever done easily. Victoria would return to the tower publicly, would announce the termination of Caleb's employment in front of journalists, would walk back into Preston's controlled space and make it appear she had accepted the terms of his ultimatum, while Caleb went in through the loading dock, wearing a maintenance contractor's identification that Nora would legitimize through a valid internal audit order. Victoria said she did not like the part of the plan that required Caleb to be inside a building, whose security infrastructure was controlled by the man trying to destroy both of them. Caleb reminded her that the first day they met, she had tried to remove him from the building for saying something she did not want to hear, and she had not managed it. Preston called Victoria's personal number directly, and his voice carried the smooth, warm certainty of a man who believes he has already won, and he said he would spare her security guard and leave the girl alone if Victoria came back alone, without conditions, and accepted the terms of a private settlement. Victoria said yes without hesitation, and she kept her voice steady through the entire call, and afterward she told Caleb only that Preston had agreed to the arrangement. She did not tell him the part about Lena, because telling him would have ended the plan before it began. Victoria's return to Kingsley Tower was covered by 3 news cameras. She had invited herself, and she stood at the building's entrance in the late afternoon light and read from a brief prepared statement in which she announced, with measured regret, that she had concluded the security breach had been exacerbated by the unauthorized actions of a contracted guard, and that his employment had been terminated effective immediately. And Preston watched from the lobby monitors and allowed himself the private satisfaction of a man watching pieces fall into place on a board he had been arranging for 2 years. He directed Dean Kessler to bring Victoria to a secured conference room and keep her there under the pretense of a pre-conference legal review, and he moved the timetable forward by 40 minutes, certain now that the last variable had been neutralized. Caleb entered through the building's east service bay 11 minutes after Victoria's statement, wearing a gray work jacket and carrying a toolbox modified to hold a folded document set, and Nora's audit authorization got him through the freight elevator without delay. The route to the K-17 sublevel took him through 3 corridors and 1 locked junction, and the junction was where Kessler was waiting, not with a team, but alone, which told Caleb that whatever was about to be offered was not for witnesses. Kessler named a number with 5 zeros after the first digit and said the offer was clean, the exit was clean, and all that was required was the card and a quiet disappearance from Chicago before midnight. Caleb set the toolbox down slowly and said no in the same tone he had used in the lobby on the first morning, without escalation and without regret. Kessler gave the order to the 2 guards at the end of the corridor, and Caleb did not fight them. He addressed them, pulling from the document set the termination orders bearing Victoria's forged signature, asking each of them to look at the dates against the building's international travel logs, asking them whether they had ever received an instruction from the CEO directly, or whether every command they had followed for the past 18 months had arrived through one man's voice. One guard looked at the dates and lowered his radio. The second looked at the first guard and said nothing but did not advance. Kessler activated the secondary lockdown protocol, sealing Caleb inside the server room access corridor, and for 70 seconds there was no sound but ventilation and the distant thrum of the building's mechanical floor. Caleb found the fire suppression panel, a mechanical override system installed before Atlas Shield, governed by a physical lever rather than a digital command, and the release triggered a pressure drop in the magnetic lock circuit that opened the door into the server room without touching a single electronic terminal. He pulled the K-17 backup drive within 4 minutes, The system's own clock informed him, in blinking numerals, that Preston's lockdown sequence would initiate in under 10 minutes. Atlas Shield sealed Kingsley Tower at 6:17 in the evening, and the sound it made was not dramatic, just the soft simultaneous engagement of 260 electromagnetic locks, a sound like a building exhaling, followed by the kind of silence that crowds in enclosed spaces produce when they realize collectively that the doors no longer open. Preston Vale took the podium in the shareholder conference hall, with the composure of a man arriving at his own coronation, and he told the assembled board members and investors that what they were experiencing was the result of an unauthorized command sequence initiated from the CEO's own security credential, that Victoria Kingsley had either lost control of her own access protocols or had taken an action she could not explain, and that in either case the governance charter was clear about what the board was empowered to do next. Victoria stood up from her seat in the third row. She did not shout, did not threaten, did not perform the kind of cold fury that had once made every person in a room flinch and comply. She spoke in a register her employees had never heard from her before, steady and direct, and carrying a quality that can only be called honest, and she said that she had built a culture in that company where the cost of telling the truth was too high for most people to pay, and that she had mistaken obedience for loyalty and fear for respect, and she was telling them now, clearly, that no one in this room should follow an instruction simply because the person issuing it held a title. Caleb walked into the conference hall through the fire door at the hall's north end, with the K-17 drive in his hand, and Preston turned to Kessler and said, with the impatience of a man who has run out of patience for complications, to remove him. Kessler told the nearest security officer to detain Caleb. The officer was 26 years old, and he had worked in the building for 8 months, and he had spent most of those months watching people absorb instructions without question, and he looked at Caleb and then at Kessler, and then he lowered his hand and said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has just decided something important, he hasn't done anything wrong. The officer beside him made the same decision. Then the one behind him. It spread through the room the way a true thing spreads when it finally has air, not loudly, not with ceremony, just a sequence of hands coming down and stances shifting, a small army of people declining, in the same moment, to be the instrument of someone else's wrong order. Nora Bellamy connected the K-17 drive to the room's main display through a hardline port, and the data came up on every screen simultaneously. Wire transfer records from 11 shell companies, master key activation logs, cross-referenced against Preston's private calendar, the original unaltered footage of Elias Ward in the relay station, confused, unarmed, frightened, and the instruction chain from Preston to Kessler authorizing the fabricated threat video. Victoria played the audio recording from her coat pocket. Preston's voice, 3 days earlier, offering her personal assets in exchange for her resignation, describing in his own words every lever he had pulled and every name he had used to pull it. Elias appeared on the room's secondary screen through a live connection Nora had set up from a secured location, and he confirmed the architecture of the fraud in the measured, technical language of a man who had built the system and understood it completely. Preston looked at the federal officers entering through the service entrance and then looked at Dean Kessler, and in the space between those two looks he tried to construct a version of the story in which Kessler had acted alone. Kessler had anticipated this. He had spent enough years watching Preston manage problems by finding someone below him to absorb them, and he set his own device on the table before anyone asked him to, containing 14 months of encrypted communications. Preston was placed in custody without the building sustaining so much as a broken window. And when Victoria turned to face the room, Preston said to her from the doorway, "Without fear, you cannot control them." She answered him clearly, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "I don't need to control people who are brave enough to tell me when I'm wrong." The charges filed against Preston Vale covered federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement exceeding $220 million, coercion of company officers, and the sale of sensitive infrastructure, access to a foreign commercial entity whose interests overlapped in several uncomfortable directions with documented state actors, a dimension of the case that moved the matter from civil litigation into the offices of people who operated in buildings without exterior signage. Dean Kessler accepted a cooperation agreement and provided testimony that prosecutors described as comprehensive and credible. He would serve time, but less of it than the man he had served. Elias Ward returned to Kingsley Tower 3 weeks after the conference, not as an employee but as an independent technical advisor hired by the board to rebuild Atlas Shield from the architecture out, to find every point where the system's design had created a blind spot and to close it, and to document, for the first time in the product's history, exactly what its master access protocol could and could not do. He moved through the building's technical floors with the proprietary ease of a man who had spent the better part of a decade building the thing he was now being paid to improve. And when he encountered the young engineers assigned to the rebuild, he told them the same thing every time. The most important design principle in any security system is that no single person should hold a key that everyone else is locked out of. Victoria convened a full company meeting 6 days after the lockdown, and she did not begin with results or litigation updates or forward guidance. She began with an apology, specific and named, to the 11 employees who had been terminated or effectively forced out over the previous 18 months under instructions falsely attributed to her. And she offered each of them reinstatement or a settlement of their choosing without legal conditions. She announced 3 structural changes to the company's governance: a protection clause for any employee who formally objected to an instruction they believed to be unlawful or unsafe, a standing order granting the security and compliance divisions the right to refuse directives that lacked documented legal basis, and the creation of an independent reporting channel to the board that bypassed the executive layer entirely. The changes were not universally celebrated, and Victoria told the board members who expressed concern that friction was preferable to a sealed room. She offered Caleb the position of Global Security Director, which came with an office on the 32nd floor and a compensation package structured for a man of his background, and he declined it with the same straightforwardness he had brought to every other moment in the preceding 2 weeks. He accepted instead a role that did not exist yet in the company's organizational chart: Director of Security Integrity, reporting exclusively to the independent board committee with a mandate to flag any instruction, from any level of the organization, that could not withstand a clear-eyed second look. Victoria asked, when the paperwork was reviewed, whether this meant he would continue to refuse her orders. He said that was precisely what she was paying him for. Lena visited Chicago 2 weeks later, arriving on a Friday afternoon with a backpack and the confident stride of someone who had never quite managed to inherit her father's tendency toward worry, and she shook Victoria's hand in the Kingsley Tower lobby with an ease that made the 2 women seem, briefly, like old acquaintances meeting in an expected place. She thanked Victoria for keeping her father in one piece, and then told her, with the friendly directness of a 19-year-old who has watched her father navigate impossible situations, that he was the most stubborn person she had ever known, and that Victoria should factor that into whatever arrangement they were building. Victoria said it was the quality she respected most about him. Lena considered this, decided it was a reasonable position, and went to find coffee. That evening, Victoria asked Caleb to dinner, and she was careful, for once, about the precision of her language. She said it was not a meeting, and it was not a directive, and he was under no obligation that could be traced to his employment. He smiled, which was not a thing she had seen him do often enough to have stopped noticing it, and he said yes. The morning after came clear and cold, the kind of Chicago morning that makes the lake look like hammered steel, and Victoria walked through the lobby of Kingsley Tower, and something was different in the way the space received her. Not the old silence of people contracting inward against a coming storm, but the ordinary ambient noise of a building at work, voices crossing, someone laughing near the reception desk, a young analyst in a hurry almost walking into her and stopping to say, with genuine apology but no particular terror, that he had noticed an error in the rollout projections and wanted to flag it before the morning brief. She stopped, she listened, she thanked him. Caleb stood near the entrance as he always did, in the posture of a man who has never needed to make himself larger to take up the right amount of space. Not bowing, not challenging, simply present, watching the room with the patient attention of someone who has decided that the most important thing a person can do in a building full of people is make sure that when something is wrong, the person nearest to it feels safe enough to say so. Victoria met his eyes across the marble hall, and this time she did not feel the edge of something resistant in that gaze. She felt, for the first time in longer than she cared to name, exactly what she had been trying to build a company around. Not the compliance of fear, but the stillness of a room where the truth could finally find its way in.